Thomas Blake had been a detective for 22 years before he walked away. He did not retire with a pension or a party. He simply stopped showing up. His last case had broken something inside him, something he never bothered to fix. That case involved a man named Simon Frost, a wealthy businessman who had killed 3 women and buried them in his own basement. Blake had gathered enough evidence to put Frost away for life, spending countless nights piecing together forensic reports and witness statements. But on the day of the trial, a technicality set Frost free. A single piece of evidence had been logged incorrectly, and the judge had no choice but to dismiss. Blake watched the man smile at the cameras outside the courthouse, radiating arrogance and contempt. That was the moment Blake decided the law was a lie, a fragile curtain hiding the rot beneath. He moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, kept the blinds half-drawn, and spoke to no one. For 3 years, he lived like a ghost, eating alone and sleeping in fits. The only news he followed was about criminals escaping justice. Every week there was another story, a murderer released on bail, a rapist given probation, a drug lord whose lawyers buried the evidence under endless appeals. Blake stopped reading after a while. It only made the anger worse, curdling inside him like spoiled milk that never drained away. Then one morning, his phone rang. It was an old colleague from the force, a man named Detective Caleb Rook. He said 4 words that pulled Blake back into the world, yanking him from his self-imposed grave: someone is cleaning house. A vigilante had appeared in the city. No one knew his name or his face. What they knew were his results. Over 6 months, 8 criminals who had escaped justice were found dead in their own homes. Each death looked like an accident at first. A fall down the stairs. A gas leak. A heart attack. But Rook had noticed something strange, a detail that nagged at his professional instincts. Every victim had a small mark burned into the skin behind their left ear, no larger than a fingernail. The mark was a blindfolded woman holding a sword, etched with surgical precision and deliberate care. It was not a symbol anyone recognized, not from any gang or secret society. It was something new. Rook sent Blake the files. He read them in his dark apartment, feeling something stir inside him for the first time in years, a faint pulse of curiosity beneath the numbness. The victims were all guilty. That was undeniable. But the method bothered him, scratching at his detective's mind. The vigilante was not just killing. He was sending a message, a statement carved into flesh. The burned symbol was a signature. It said, "I am the justice you failed to deliver." Blake knew that feeling well. He had felt it every night since Simon Frost walked free, a hot coal in his chest that never cooled, not even in sleep. But he also knew where that path led, into darkness without end. He called Rook back and agreed to consult on the case, unofficially. He would not carry a badge or a gun. He would just look at the evidence. His first request was simple, almost childlike: take him to the latest crime scene. The latest victim was a man named Leonard Finch. Finch had been a security guard who, 2 years earlier, had broken into the apartment of a young woman and attacked her. DNA evidence placed him at the scene without question, but the prosecutor mishandled the chain of custody, and Finch was released on a technicality that made headlines. He moved to a new neighborhood and lived quietly, waiting for the public to forget his face and his crime. The vigilante did not forget. Finch was found in his kitchen, slumped over the table as if asleep after a long day. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, attributed to natural causes by a tired coroner. But Blake saw what Rook had seen, the small inconsistencies that betrayed murder. The position of the body was too perfect. The chair was pushed in. The hands were folded on the tabletop, almost reverent. It looked staged, like a photograph from a magazine about interior design. Blake examined the mark behind Finch's left ear. The burn was precise, made with a custom tool that left clean edges and even depth. He asked Rook if the police had found any traces of forced entry. Rook said no. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were sealed. Finch lived alone, and no one had seen anyone enter or leave, not even a shadow passing by a window. Blake felt a cold certainty settle in his chest, heavy and absolute. The vigilante was not a brute forcing his way in. He was a planner, someone who studied his targets for weeks and found a way to reach them without violence or struggle. The death looked natural because it was designed to look natural, a perfect illusion. Blake asked Rook for a list of every criminal who had walked free in the last 5 years. The list was long. Over 200 names, each one a person the courts had failed to convict, each one a wound in the fabric of justice. Blake spent 3 nights in Rook's office, reading case files and drinking bad coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and regret. He looked for patterns, for the invisible threads that connected the dead. The vigilante's victims were not random. They were all people whose crimes had been proven beyond doubt, but whose freedom was guaranteed by legal errors and technical loopholes that disgusted the public. Blake realized the killer was not just punishing the guilty. He was punishing the system itself, mocking its imperfections with every death. Each victim represented a failure of the courts, a moment when procedure mattered more than truth, when paperwork outweighed pain. Blake also noticed something else, a whisper of a clue. The vigilante knew details that were not public, information that had never been released to the press or the public. In the Finch case, the police had never published the name of the prosecutor who lost the evidence. But the vigilante had left a newspaper clipping about that prosecutor on Finch's kitchen table, folded neatly into a square. That meant the killer had inside information. Someone in the legal system was helping him. Blake narrowed his suspects to 3 people, a retired judge, a defense attorney known for winning impossible cases, and a forensic technician who had access to the evidence room. He ran their names through his old contacts, calling in favors from people who still owed him. The judge had died a year ago. The attorney was in Europe on an extended vacation. The technician, a man named Peter Hale, had quit his job 6 months earlier and vanished without a forwarding address. Blake decided to find Hale first. Peter Hale had worked in the city's forensic lab for 15 years, a quiet man in a white coat. He had seen evidence mishandled, witnesses coerced, and guilty men walk free on technicalities that made his blood boil in silence. His colleagues described him as quiet, meticulous, and deeply frustrated with the system he served every day. 6 months before the vigilante appeared, Hale submitted a formal complaint about a superior who had lost a crucial blood sample in a murder case, effectively destroying the prosecution. The complaint was ignored, buried in paperwork and office politics. Hale resigned the next week and told no one where he was going, not even his closest friends. Blake tracked his last known address to a small town 3 hours north of the city, a place with one main street and a lake that froze in winter and thawed in spring. He drove there alone, in a borrowed car that smelled of old cigarettes and stale air. The address was a cabin by the lake, surrounded by pine trees that whispered in the wind. The door was unlocked, swinging open at his touch. Inside, Blake found a wall covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. Every face on that wall was a criminal who had escaped justice, a gallery of the unpunished. Some were already dead at the vigilante's hands. Others were still alive, marked for future attention with red X's. In the center of the wall was a photograph of Simon Frost, the man whose freedom had destroyed Blake's career. Frost's face was circled in red ink, a target. Next to it, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Last one." Blake stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, his mind churning. He understood now. Peter Hale was not the vigilante. Hale was the planner, the one who gathered the information. But someone else was doing the killings. And that someone was saving Simon Frost for the end. Blake called Rook and told him what he had found, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Rook arrived with a team 2 hours later, blue lights flashing through the trees like angry fireflies. The cabin was processed for fingerprints, DNA, and any trace of Hale's whereabouts. But Hale was gone. He had left the cabin at least a week before Blake arrived, clearing out with care and leaving almost nothing behind. The only new piece of evidence was a notebook hidden under the floorboards, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture and decay. It contained names, addresses, and detailed routines of every target, written in Hale's neat hand. The last page had a single line that made Blake's skin crawl and his heart stutter. "When Blake figures it out, he will understand." Blake read that line 10 times, each repetition deepening his unease and his sense of being watched. It felt personal, aimed directly at him like an arrow. The vigilante was not just targeting criminals. He was targeting Blake. Or rather, he was forcing Blake to watch, to witness the justice that the law refused to provide, to be a helpless spectator. The notebook also contained a list of dates. Each date corresponded to a killing, marked with a small check. The pattern was accelerating, gaining speed like a rolling stone. At first, the vigilante killed once every 2 months. Then once a month. Then every 2 weeks. The next date on the list was 3 days away, a deadline hanging over everything. The target was a man named Arthur Dane, a former police officer who had planted evidence to convict an innocent man. When the truth came out years later, Dane was fired but never charged with a crime. He lived in a quiet suburb, protected by his old colleagues who still owed him favors. Blake knew he had 3 days to stop the next killing or to catch the vigilante in the act. Blake set up surveillance outside Arthur Dane's house. He parked across the street, in a van borrowed from Rook that had tinted windows and a stale smell of old coffee. He watched the house for 8 hours straight, his eyes growing heavy and his back aching. Dane lived alone, except for a small dog that barked at every passerby, from mail carriers to joggers to children on bicycles. Blake saw no one suspicious. No strangers. No delivery trucks. No unusual cars lingering at the curb with idling engines. The second day was the same, a dull repetition of nothing, broken only by meals eaten from vending machines. Blake began to doubt the notebook. Maybe the dates were not accurate. Maybe Hale had planted false information to throw him off, to make him chase shadows. But on the third day, something changed. A man knocked on Dane's door at noon, just as the sun reached its peak and shadows shortened. He was middle-aged, dressed in a postal uniform, carrying a package that looked ordinary and harmless. Dane let him in with a casual greeting, his dog wagging its tail. Blake watched through his binoculars, his heart rate climbing into his throat. The man stayed inside for 7 minutes, no more. When he left, he walked to a postal truck parked around the corner and drove away smoothly, without hurry. Blake noted the license plate. He called Rook and asked him to run it through the database. The plate belonged to a rental company. The name on the rental agreement was a fake, a dead end with no trail. Blake realized the man was not a postal worker. He was the vigilante. He had assumed the killer was someone else, but now the truth was clear. He rushed to Dane's front door and pounded on it with his fist. No answer. He forced the door open with his shoulder and found Dane sitting on his couch, eyes open, not breathing. No visible wounds. No struggle. The dog was asleep on the floor, unharmed. Blake checked behind Dane's left ear. The mark was there. Fresh. Blake stood over the body, breathing hard, his mind racing through the facts. The vigilante had killed Dane while Blake was watching the house, only 100 feet away, separated by glass and distance. He had walked in, delivered the package, and walked out. 7 minutes. That was all it took to end a life. Blake searched the house and found the package on the kitchen counter, untouched and waiting. It was empty except for a single photograph, glossy and new, printed on high-quality paper. The photograph showed Simon Frost, the man from Blake's last case, standing outside his own house. Frost looked healthy and relaxed, unaware that he was being watched, perhaps watering his garden or checking his mail. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in the same careful handwriting, "Tomorrow night, you choose." Blake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, a cold that came from inside. The vigilante was not just taunting the police. He was taunting Blake specifically, playing a game with rules only he understood, a psychological attack. He knew Thomas Blake. He knew Blake's history with Frost, the pain and humiliation of that failed trial, the years of silence. And he was giving Blake an ultimatum, a choice between duty and desire. He could try to stop the vigilante tomorrow night, or he could let him finish what the law could not. Blake called Rook and told him everything, his voice hollow and distant. Rook sent a team to secure the scene. Then Rook asked Blake a question he did not want to answer, a question that cut to the bone. He asked if Blake was going to stop the vigilante or if he was going to let him kill Simon Frost. Blake said he did not know, because he truly did not, the answer hidden from himself. Rook told him that was not good enough. He reminded Blake that he was still a detective, even if he had thrown away his badge and let himself rot in that apartment. Blake hung up and drove back to his apartment, the photograph burning in his pocket like a coal. The next day, Blake did something he had not done in 3 years. He put on a suit, a dark gray one that still fit, and went to visit Simon Frost. Frost lived in a gated community, behind walls and security cameras and guards who checked every ID with bored expressions. He had made a fortune in real estate after the trial, using the publicity from his acquittal to sell a book about police corruption and victimhood. Blake was let in by a guard who recognized his name from the old news reports, raising an eyebrow. Frost was sitting by his pool, drinking something expensive with a slice of citrus floating on top. He smiled when he saw Blake, a cold and knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. He said he had been expecting a visit for some time now. Blake asked what that meant. Frost said he had received a letter 2 weeks ago, slid under his front gate in a plain envelope. The letter said that someone was going to kill him on a specific date. That date was today. Frost had hired private security, but he was not afraid. He said the vigilante had killed only criminals who were actually guilty. He was innocent, at least in the eyes of the law. Blake did not respond to that, keeping his face neutral. He asked to see the letter. Frost handed it over with theatrical reluctance, as if parting with a treasure. The handwriting matched the notes from Hale's cabin, the same loops and slants, the same pressure. The letter said, "You destroyed Thomas Blake. Now I will destroy you." Blake realized then that the vigilante's motivation was not just justice. It was personal, driven by something deeper than principle, something like loyalty or vengeance. He knew Blake. He might have been someone Blake had helped in the past, or someone who had watched his career fall apart from the inside. Blake asked Frost if he recognized the handwriting. Frost laughed and said he did not read the handwriting of nobodies, waving his hand dismissively. Blake left the gated community with a heavy feeling in his chest, the weight of choices not yet made pressing down on him. That night, Blake returned to Frost's neighborhood. He parked outside the gates and waited, the engine off, the windows cracked open for air. He had told Rook his plan. He would watch the house and call for backup the moment he saw the vigilante. Rook had agreed, reluctantly, his voice tight with concern and something else Blake could not name. Rook posted 2 uniformed officers nearby, out of sight, hidden behind a row of hedges that bordered the road. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The street grew dark and silent, only the occasional car passing, headlights cutting through the dark. At 11 o'clock, the lights in Frost's house went off, room by room, like candles being snuffed. Blake assumed Frost had gone to sleep, perhaps feeling safe behind his walls and his hired guards. Then he saw a figure moving along the back wall of the property, low and fast, barely visible against the darkness. The figure was of medium height, dressed in dark clothing that absorbed the moonlight, moving with the silence of someone who had done this many times before. Blake got out of his car and walked toward the gate, his joints protesting after hours of stillness. He called Rook and told him to move in, his whisper urgent and strained. But before the officers arrived, the figure reached Frost's back door. Blake saw him pull something from his jacket. It was not a weapon. It was a small metal tool, a pick designed for locks. He worked the lock in seconds and disappeared inside, as quiet as a ghost passing through a wall. Blake ran, his shoes slapping the pavement, his breath coming in short gasps. He reached the back door just as he heard a noise from inside. Not a scream. Not a struggle. Just a soft thud, like a book falling off a shelf onto a carpet. Blake pushed the door open and stepped into the kitchen, his breath caught in his throat. The vigilante was standing over Simon Frost, who was on the floor, unconscious but alive, his chest rising and falling. The vigilante turned to face Blake. He pulled down his mask. It was Caleb Rook, Blake's old colleague. The man who had called him back into the world, who had sat with him through cold nights in his office, sharing coffee and silence. He looked at Blake with calm, tired eyes, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time, rehearsing what he would say. He said he knew Blake would figure it out eventually, that he was too good a detective not to see through the disguise. Blake could not speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, no sound coming out. Rook explained everything, his voice low and steady. Peter Hale was his partner, his silent architect. He gathered the information, the routines, the vulnerabilities. Rook did the killings, the final act, the hand that delivered justice. He had been doing it for years, long before the first victim was found, refining his methods, never leaving a trace. He only told Blake because he needed his help to find Frost. Frost had escaped justice once, and Rook would not let it happen again, not while he still drew breath. Blake asked him why, his voice barely a whisper, cracking with betrayal. Rook said he had spent 20 years watching guilty people walk free. He had watched Blake destroy himself over Frost, drinking alone in that dark apartment, fading away. He had watched victims cry in his arms while their attackers laughed outside the courthouse. The law was a machine that protected the powerful and punished the weak, a broken engine. He decided to build a different machine, slower but more precise, one that never failed. Blake asked him to stop, to surrender, to let the system work for once. Rook shook his head slowly, sadly. He said Frost would wake up in 10 minutes with no memory of what happened. But the mark behind his ear would be there, burned into his skin. And everyone who saw it would know that justice had finally found him. Blake had a choice. He could arrest Rook or he could walk away. Rook handed him his gun, grip first. Blake took the gun. It was heavier than he remembered, cold against his palm, the metal smelling of oil. He looked at Rook, at his steady gaze that held no fear, only acceptance. He looked at Simon Frost, who was starting to stir on the floor, a low moan escaping his lips, his fingers twitching. He thought about the 3 women in Frost's basement, their names and faces he had memorized years ago, never forgetting. He thought about the trial, the technicality, the smile on Frost's face outside the courthouse, the way he had winked at the cameras. He thought about 3 years of darkness in his apartment, the blinds always drawn, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. Then he put the gun on the kitchen table, setting it down gently as if it might break, as if it were made of glass. He told Rook to leave. He would tell the officers that he found Frost unconscious and the vigilante had fled before he could get a look at his face. Rook asked him if he was sure, his voice soft for the first time, almost tender. Blake said he was sure of one thing: the law had failed, but he would not fail it again by becoming what Rook had become. He was not a vigilante. He was a detective. Even if he no longer carried a badge, even if his name had been dragged through the mud, that was what he would remain until his last breath. Rook nodded slowly, a flicker of something like respect or sadness in his eyes. He put his mask back on, adjusting the straps with practiced hands. Then he disappeared through the back door, melting into the night like smoke. Blake heard his footsteps fade into the distance, then nothing but the sound of his own breathing. A minute later, the uniformed officers arrived, flashlights bobbing, radios crackling. Blake told them the vigilante had gotten away. He said Frost was alive and unharmed. They asked if he had seen the killer's face. Blake said no. He had seen nothing, and nothing was what he would tell. Simon Frost woke up in a hospital bed the next morning, disoriented and groggy, a headache pounding behind his eyes. He had no memory of the attack, only a vague sense of falling into darkness. But the mark behind his left ear was real, a small burn in the shape of a blindfolded woman with a sword, red and raw. The police photographed it, catalogued it, filed it away in evidence. The news spread quickly, faster than wildfire, jumping from website to website. Frost's lawyers tried to keep it quiet, threatening lawsuits, but someone leaked the image to a reporter. Within a week, Frost was a pariah. His business partners abandoned him, his board of directors voted him out. His book was pulled from stores, pulped into nothing. People who had once defended him in public now crossed the street to avoid him, looking away. He lived the rest of his life in fear, jumping at shadows, never knowing if the vigilante would return to finish what he had started. As for Caleb Rook, he vanished completely. His apartment was empty, scrubbed clean of prints. His phone was disconnected. His bank accounts were untouched. Peter Hale was never found, though search teams combed the northern woods for months without success. The killings stopped. No new victims appeared. The symbol of the blindfolded woman with the sword became a legend, debated on internet forums and whispered about in police stations late at night. Thomas Blake did not return to his dark apartment. He moved to a small town by the ocean, where he spent his days walking the shore and watching the gray waves roll in, endless and patient. He never spoke of Rook or the vigilante again. But sometimes, late at night, alone in his small house with the salt wind rattling the windows, he would touch the back of his own left ear, where no mark existed, and wonder if he had made the right choice. He would never know for sure. That was the price of being a man who still believed in the law, even when the law had long since stopped believing in him.